Dream Team, it's your boy Neal back with another reaction video from YouTube channel Second Thought. This is why the United States can't handle crisis. I'm intrigued to see this. I feel like I got a couple reasons in the back of my head, but I want to see what they say before I sound stupid. Now, before we jump into this, I need you guys to smack that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, get a video a thumbs up so it gets suggested. Social media and Patreon, all up top. You can subscribe to any of it, put all the links in the description. All you got to do is hit the link, follow me, talk to me, shoot me. I talk back. If you got a favorite video you want to see me react to, you can subscribe to Patreon, leave a suggestion, or in the description section there's a Google form link. Whoa, you guys!
This episode was made in collaboration with Ugopnik. Be sure to check out their video after this.
Okay.
If you were born at any point after the 80s, odds are the entirety of your lived experience has been one of crisis. For people my age,
really?
our formative years were filled with the consequences.
I was born in '95. I haven't known much crisis, but
has been one of crisis.
What you talking about?
For people my age, our formative years were filled with the consequences of U.S. activity. Our earliest memories include 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq under false pretenses. Then we had the 2008 housing crash, the realization that climate change was nearing a point of no return, the acceleration of suicidal deregulation and privatization, which has left our infrastructure weak and fragile, the skyrocketing cost of tuition, saddling young people who were told college was the only way to succeed with insurmountable debt and increasingly worthless degrees. We've seen the birth and rapid...
Yes, I heard it. That's the one that affected me. The other ones, I guess I was too young for them to affect me. So, except for 9/11, I remember 9/11. But the other one, I was just too young for it to affect me. So it didn't bother me because I guess I was selfish. I only really cared about what bothered me. But that college one, that affected me directly because I was told my whole life that you needed college, and then I went to college and I got thousands and thousands of dollars in debt, and I was like, did I really need this? Because I don't even use my degree. All right, keep it going.
With insurmountable debt and increasingly worthless degrees. We've seen the birth and rapid rise of the gig economy, relegating huge portions of the population to precarity and poverty. And of course, we've watched our COVID response become the worst in the world, despite having advanced knowledge of the danger and plenty of resources to handle the situation appropriately. For millennials and younger generations, there's no such thing as the good old days. We never experienced them. We'll cover that topic more thoroughly in a future video, but in this week's episode, we're going to examine why the US seems to be completely incapable of handling crises. Now, this video could easily be over an hour long. The past few decades have seen an alarming acceleration in crisis mismanagement, and it would take way too long to cover them all. We're just going to focus on a handful of them. Before we get to the big ones, let's start with a very American problem: obesity. At first glance, you wouldn't...
That is a very American problem. From watching a lot of videos, I'm learning that is a very American problem. And there's a lot of us.
Let's start with a very American problem: obesity. At first glance, you wouldn't necessarily think to call obesity a crisis. But when you look at the numbers in the US, things become a bit more grim. As of 2018, 42.4% of all American adults were obese. That number increased drastically between 2000 and 2018. Shooting up by nearly 12%, while severe obesity nearly doubled, from 4.7% to 9.2%. Obesity among children is also a big problem. Of children between the ages of 2 and 19, nearly 1 in 5 are obese. Now, obesity doesn't just mean you're a bit overweight. It's a serious health condition, and it comes with a whole slew of problems: heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, and increased susceptibility to certain types of cancer, not to mention a lower quality of life and shorter average lifespan. The fact that nearly half of American adults are obese should be a huge red flag. According to one study conducted in 2008, the estimated annual medical cost of obesity in the US was a staggering $147 billion. And judging by the increased prevalence of obesity in the years since, we can only assume that cost has risen dramatically. Obesity causes nearly 1 in 5 deaths in the US. That's a crisis, and it's not talked about nearly enough. Now, some people will simply tell those suffering from obesity to eat better, and that's not unreasonable. But the roots of the crisis go far beyond individual responsibility. Back in the 50s, President Eisenhower had a heart attack, which sparked a scientific debate over the causes of obesity, which was known to cause heart disease. There were two main schools of thought, one led by British physiologist and nutritionist John Yudkin, and the other by Ancel Keys, an American physiologist. Yudkin believed that obesity was mainly caused by sugar, and Keyes thought it was caused by fat. Eventually, it became apparent that Yudkin was correct. Sugar was the culprit behind the condition. But wait, if we identified the cause all the way back in the 50s, why is the problem so much worse today? Well,
on everything, people ain't giving up sugar, and I grew up on sodas, but I never was like overweight or obese growing up just because I played like so many sports. Like I was always moving. I was never like still. I was always doing something. But yeah, sugar. The way I see some of these kids eat today, I can understand it. I can understand.
Identified the cause all the way back in the 50s. Why is the problem so much worse today? Well, the sugar industry didn't take kindly to the scientific findings. They funded disinformation campaigns and lobbied the government to support the low-fat diet initiative in an attempt to maintain their profits. This not only helped them keep their current profits, it also drastically increased them because in order to make low-fat foods appealing to an American palate, manufacturers had to add more sugar. So, the result of a scientific study clearly linking sugar to obesity was not the reduction of sugar in our diets, but a massive disinformation campaign that ended up increasing the amount of sugar in our foods, thereby worsening the very problem we wanted to solve. Keep this result in mind, because you'll begin to notice a pattern. So, what have we done to combat obesity in the decades since the initial studies? Well, not much. Some states have tried to implement sugar taxes, but on the whole, we haven't even made a dent in the crisis. It's only getting worse. In the case of obesity, not only have we failed to handle—
That used to be me. That one person with 4 12-packs of soda in his fridge. I was on my path to being overweight. I think I'm still overweight for my size and my age. But I cut it out, bro. I started looking in the mirror and I just wasn't happy with myself. So I was like, we got to fix this. And so cut all the soda out.
Crisis. It's only getting worse. In the case of obesity, not only have we failed to handle it, our capitalist system caused it. A giant industry wanted to keep making money, so they threw the American people under the bus, and we've been dealing with the same problem for well over half a century now. Let's move on to one of the big crises, one that affects not only the US, but the entire world: climate change. Whether you think humans are influencing the climate change or not, the data is clear. Our climate is changing dramatically and rapidly. Sea ice is melting at unprecedented rates, causing a rise in sea level. The oceans are becoming more acidic, leading to the annihilation of coral reefs. Violent weather events have become far more common, and we're beginning to see 1,000-year storms, droughts, and floods every few years. Thousands of species are at risk of extinction. Disease is able to spread farther and faster thanks to longer warm seasons, and entire regions are becoming unlivable. In early 2020, I helped shoot a documentary called The Final Years of Majuro, which documented the effects of sea level rise in the Marshall Islands. I saw firsthand what will happen to the world's coastal regions and islands. They're going underwater. Their populations will have to evacuate or be destroyed. Since the US likes to think of itself as the leader of the world, surely we're at the forefront of climate change mitigation, right? Well, no. In fact, we're not even close. The United States is one of the few places on Earth where elected officials openly deny the existence of climate change. The climate doesn't care whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. Or, to quote a certain internet person, facts don't care about your feelings. We have the facts. Climate change is happening. So why do our politicians, even the ones who acknowledge the crisis, refuse to address the problem? You won't be surprised to learn that once again, corporate interests stand in the way. In order to understand the present situation, let's take a trip back to the late 70s. Towards the end of the decade and into the 80s, Exxon was at the forefront of climate research. Not because they particularly cared about the planet, but because they wanted to understand the effects of the changing climate to better position themselves against the competition in the future. For example, when they began drilling in the Beaufort Sea in the Canadian Arctic, Exxon scientists wondered whether the increased CO2 emissions would warm the region enough to make the voyage and extraction less treacherous, and therefore more profitable. With goals like these in mind, Exxon began conducting some of the most thorough climate change studies to date. Between 1986 and 1992, the company used and developed cutting-edge models to understand the effects of CO2 and other greenhouse gases on the climate, accumulating incredibly valuable data. To use the Beaufort Sea example again, Exxon scientists determined that should atmospheric CO2 concentration double, and they predicted it would by 2050, the region's open water season would lengthen from 2 months to 3, possibly even 5. They underestimated how quickly atmospheric CO2 would accumulate, but they were exactly correct about the lengthening of the Beaufort open water season. And this is just one example. Their models also accurately predicted rising temperatures, dramatic weather, severe ice loss, droughts, floods, and all manner of other consequences to their actions. And all of this was collected not with the intention of curbing the fallout, but of understanding how they could best position themselves to take advantage of the changing climate. As discourse around climate change heated up, so to speak, Exxon was in a position to do some real good. They had some of the best data available, and it would have made a huge difference in understanding how best to mitigate the consequences of climate fallout. Instead, they chose to do the same thing the sugar industry did. They funded opposition groups, launched disinformation campaigns, and buried their own internal studies so that the public would never learn what they had discovered. For
What? It's crazy, man. Like when they tell you like it's literally like all about the dollar, they mean it. And it's like, forget people. Like, it is all about the dollar. As I'm watching this video, it's scary to almost, you know what I'm saying? Like, at some point, like, there's got to be a certain amount of money that's enough, but so you can start caring about people, right? Your industry would have still been healthy. It's like they want more. It's the disease. We have the disease of more, always wanting more. And I understand that as long as it's harmless, like not at the expense of human beings, not at the expense of humanity.
And buried their own internal studies so that the public would never learn what they had discovered. For decades, Exxon and other oil and gas giants paid huge sums of money to suppress the facts and lobby politicians to sow confusion and distrust of established science. It wasn't until the mid-2000s that Exxon finally distanced themselves from some of the more outspoken climate denial groups, like the Competitive Enterprise Institute. But to this day, they play a major role in subverting the effort to do anything at all about climate change. And they continue to fund climate-denying politicians who help secure oil and gas profits, to the detriment of the entire human race. Exxon denies this, of course, but if you'd like to see the evidence for yourself, I've left links to their internal documents and to an investigative study on the matter in the description. Today, thanks in no small part to the greed of fossil fuel companies, we are years behind where we should be when it comes to mitigating climate fallout. Heck, in the US, we can't even agree it's happening at all. So again, just like with the obesity crisis, we're not only incapable of solving the problem, our capitalist system created the problem. Let's move on to our final big crisis, coronavirus. We're now right around the 1-year mark for when Americans really began to realize just how serious the problem was. In the past year, over 500,000 Americans have died of COVID. We've had more cases and more deaths than anywhere else on Earth. This is despite the fact that we have almost limitless resources to spend on overcoming crises like this one. If we're really the greatest country on Earth, why has our coronavirus response been one of, if not the worst in the world? As always, to better understand the situation, we need to rewind a bit. When COVID first came to the States, the official response, as with climate change, was denial. It immediately became a political issue. If Trump were to take the necessary measures to ensure the public's safety, he believed he would have tanked his approval rating and his economic numbers. Unsurprisingly, both tanked anyway after Americans started dropping like flies. But the story of our COVID response is not just about politics. A disease outbreak is perhaps the only thing able to reveal all the little cracks in the country's armor at the same time. Conservatives declared we didn't want to go into lockdown because that was government overreach, a rallying cry taken up by conservative voters. Of course, the politicians and wealthy business moguls didn't really care about government overreach. They just wanted to make sure American workers kept working so the executives could maintain their profits. Once it became apparent that we would have to enforce some kind of lockdown, things started to snowball. Many American businesses operate on razor-thin margins to reduce costs and maximize profits. So when they lost business, they immediately had to lay off their workers in order to weather the storm. Since American healthcare is tied to employment, those millions of workers suddenly found themselves without a paycheck or access to medical care if they became sick. You know, something that happens quite often in a pandemic. Since our country lacks even the barest provisions for the unemployed, millions of households soon ran out of money. They couldn't pay rent. Landlords are some of those people who run dangerously lean operations, relying on their tenants' rent checks to pay off their properties. They begin to evict their tenants. Over the next few months, millions of Americans contract COVID. And our bizarre obsession with freedom led many to refuse to wear a mask. A tiny, simple piece of cloth that's proven to be effective in helping prevent the spread of disease. Our case numbers exploded, becoming the worst in the world. Hospitals were overrun. We had to start digging mass graves.
We were so ahead of everybody, all these other countries. We were way. This is scary, bro. Like, because we like to deny a lot of stuff, and the facts are there, but somehow you still have a big group of people that deny. Like, it's actually scary.
Becoming the worst in the world. Hospitals were overrun. We had to start digging mass graves. The people who could get a hospital bed could no longer afford the medical bills because they didn't have insurance. Hundreds of thousands of people went into tremendous debt because the US is the only developed country not to have some form of universal health care. While the country was falling apart, Democrats and Republicans alike continued to make the situation worse. Republicans railed against mask mandates and asserted that the disease was no worse than the flu, or that it was a Chinese hoax. And the Democrats paid lip service to the science but lied about how well they were handling their city's outbreaks. But the politicians are not the only ones to blame. The general public must bear some of the shame as well.
Facts.
Despite mountains of data on both how dangerous the disease is and how other countries have been able to contain it, Americans flock to beaches, parties, restaurants, and the Super Bowl because, damn it, it's my God-given right as an American. Our bullheaded stubbornness and genocidal selfishness has contributed countless bodies to the pile. How many of you watching have lost a loved one to COVID? Their death was completely avoidable. Take countries like Vietnam or New Zealand. These places absolutely destroyed the virus. Despite Vietnam's proximity to China, COVID rolls in and they're like, nope, not gonna let this happen. They implement strict lockdown measures, social distancing, and contact tracing immediately. Would you like to see their COVID stats compared to ours? Here you go. Pretty stark difference.
Wow.
For those of you who feel the need to say, well, they have a smaller population, take a look at the per capita death rate. Vietnam has about a third of the US population, so we would assume that they'd have a third the number of deaths, right?
Lord.
Not even close. Vietnam, a country with a GDP of $261 billion, absolutely destroyed the US, a country with a GDP of $20 trillion, in terms of COVID response effectiveness. Of course, you won't hear about this. It's not the first time the US has decided not to talk about being beaten by the Vietnamese. So yes, by all metrics, the US coronavirus response has been among the worst in the world, quite possibly the worst considering the resources we have at our disposal. This perfect storm of capitalist fragility laid bare the failures of the most powerful nation on Earth. The country, like so many of its businesses, operates on the tiniest of margins. If we can save a single dollar by not having enough hospital beds or PPE for an emergency, we're gonna do it. If we can make more money by extorting our citizens when they need to go to the doctor, we're gonna do it. Social safety nets cost money, so they're out of the question. So are maternity leave, benefits, pensions, and fair wages. Every single aspect of our modern life is meticulously crafted to yield ever-increasing profits. And the tiniest grain of sand in the gears of this machine completely destroys our fragile equilibrium. We're not equipped to handle crises because crisis management isn't profitable. We just ignore our problems and hope things work out. This is fine for those at the top. They have the wealth to weather a year-long crisis. 99% of Americans do not. What is it going to take to get the people of this country to realize that not only can we not handle crises, our predatory capitalist system actively causes the crises? Capitalism cannot and will not solve the problems it creates. We have a homelessness crisis at the same time as an excess of housing. Why? Housing the homeless isn't profitable. We maintain low-level wars for decades at tremendous cost of human life. Why? Because war is profitable. The military-industrial complex is one of our biggest industries. It's why we ignore humanitarian crises like the war in Yemen. The United States arms the people responsible for the massacre. What happens when the next crisis is worse? How many Americans have to die before we realize that capitalism is destroying us? We already have another ticking time bomb on the horizon. Each successive generation is less well off than the previous one. Older generations, those who experienced the final years of comfort for the average American worker, are dying off. Younger people don't have the buying power their parents and grandparents did.
At all. Do not have it at all. Yes. Student loans, rising cost of living, but not rising wages. Lower wages compared to baby boomers at same. Rising cost of living, but lower wages compared to baby boomers at the same age. That's crazy. It makes no sense.
Are dying off. Younger people don't have the buying power their parents and grandparents did. We're having fewer children, mostly because we can't afford to raise children. Fewer children means fewer people to grow up and buy things. What happens when a country built on consumerism runs out of people to buy those products? Consumption falls off a cliff, GDP plummets, businesses flee to other countries, poverty skyrockets, and the American empire implodes. It's not some innate characteristic of the US that makes us incapable of handling crises. Any country with a system as hyper-capitalist as ours would suffer similarly poor performance. If you look around the world, there are plenty of mostly capitalist countries that handled the pandemic much better than the US. What's the difference? They have their guardrails intact. Social safety nets, robust unemployment assistance, universal healthcare. Their citizens are more secure, their businesses less predatory. They haven't deregulated and privatized their countries into oblivion. In America, we've removed those guardrails and stepped on the gas. After all, the biggest profits are right at the edge of the cliff. Capitalism is why we can't handle crises. If you're familiar with my channel, you know that my perspective is very US-centric. It's what I know best. If you'd like to get a more global perspective on this topic, make sure to check out Ugopnik's video next. It's a fantastic companion piece to this video. If you enjoyed this episode, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my previous episodes by clicking the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.
That was very informative, man. That was very informative. It was scary too. Watching that video, it was crazy to me. That's all we got for this one. If you guys got a favorite video you want to see or him react to, subscribe to Patreon, leave a suggestion, or in the description section, there's a Google form link. Hit the link, fill out your suggestion, send it to me. You want me to get to yours faster than others? Fill out premium. Make sure you hit subscribe to the channel, ring notification bell, get a video a thumbs up so it gets suggested. Social media and Patreon all up top. You don't subscribe to any of it, follow the links in the description. All you gotta do is hit the link, follow me, talk to me. Human. I talk back. Love talking to you guys. You guys are the most incredible team on YouTube. It's your boy D Neal. Out.